Hi, it's me again. I hope you've enjoyed the New Future of Work session so far. From all of the conversations that we've had today, it's clear that work has changed significantly this past year and a half. And anytime there's a significant disruption like that, there's also a lot of uncertainty and a lot of risk. And so in our final session of the track, we're going to talk about how we can work towards building not just a new future of work, but a future of work that is equitable for everyone. Coordinating this session are principal researchers Neville and Siddharth Suri. Jennifer recently joined Microsoft Research from Purdue, where she was a professor and the Miller Family Chair. She's a machine learning expert, and in particular, she's done a lot of really interesting research to discover and adjust for the statistical biases that emerge due to network data characteristics. Sid is a computational social scientist, and his research covers topics from computer science to behavioral economics to crowdsourcing, and he even wrote a book on crowd workers who power many AI systems. Both of them have deep insights into what happens at the intersection of technology and work, and they'll be joining me to lead a series of fireside chats with a set of experts from the academic community, including Nick Bloom from Stanford, Kathleen Carley from CMU, and Sinan and Aral from MIT.
Hi, everyone. My name is Siddharth Suri. I'm a senior principal researcher here at Microsoft Research, and it is my absolute pleasure to have one of the world's experts on working from home on hand today, and that is Nick Bloom. Nick is the William Eberly Professor of Economics at Stanford University. He's a senior fellow of the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research and the co-director of the Productivity, Innovation, and Entrepreneurship Program at the National Bureau of Economic Research. His research focuses on working from home, like I said, management practices, and uncertainty. Nick, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks very much for having me on, Sid.
So let's just start off with some of the basics. Hybrid work means many different things to many different people. How do you define hybrid, and over what dimensions are we talking about hybridity?
I normally think about it as hybrid. I mean, the normal use is like 3 days in the office, 2 days at home each week. So generally working from home, I mean, look, there's many dimensions. For example, I used to work mornings at home and afternoons at work. Pre-pandemic, because I could bike in, but most people generally either go for a full day at home or a full day at work. And hybrids generally within the week are typically thought to be like 2-3 days at home, 2-3 days in the office. So 3-2 or 2-3. It is true. I heard, Matt Mullenweg of Automatic saying even fully remote people are formally hybrid because they come in, one week a month or 1 week a quarter to come on, a retreat. But when I must have talked to 300, 400, 500 managers by now since the beginning of the pandemic, and all of them that I've spoken to mean hybrid to mean typically 3-2 or 2-3. Those are the most common versions.
So you're talking about hybridity with respect to the time dimension mostly. Great. I know you have a talk titled "Working from Home Will Stick." So you obviously think hybrid work's here to stay. Why do you think it's going to stick, and what's it going to look like? 3-2-2-3, something else?
That felt like a very brave prediction when we started on that paper in like June 2020. Now everyone's like, so what? It's kind of like why don't I go through? So there are, in that paper, we listed a bunch of things that we think would make it stick. One is, it turns out people really like it. So employers and employees are both incredibly happy with working from home. One of the big striking factors of the pandemic that now seems like ancient history is that if you remember, initially people were like, working from home will never work. It would be a disaster. We'll watch TV, fall asleep, etc. As it's happened, efficiency and productivity have been pretty good. In fact, the US economy, measures of GDP per hour worked are up versus pre-pandemic. So it's efficient. That's one reason it seems to work. The stigma around it seems to vaporize. It used to be seen as, shirking from home. That's gone. You don't hear shirking from home anymore. People have invested in getting it to work. If I look at you, you have a nice background, a headset. Teams is dramatically better. There's a lot of things. You probably can't say I have a little microphone, a webcam. We've all spent a lot of time and effort, and that's a sunk cost that's not going away. Fourth, the technology's got a lot better. So to take Teams as an example, at the beginning of the pandemic, it only had 4 windows. In April 2020, I believe it went to 9, and then it went to 49 in, I think, August 2020. And so Zoom has got a lot better. All of the technologies, the software, hardware, new laptops. I don't know if you've noticed, they're getting much better webcams. I mean, basically, technology is improving. So there's a multitude of, and finally, I think the fifth thing we mentioned in the paper, by the way, is fear of infection. So it's very clear that even post-pandemic, even when we're all vaccinated, I've been running these surveys of 5,000 Americans a month since the beginning of the pandemic. So we've asked, I don't know, 80,000 people or something by now. And over again, about 2/3 of them say post-pandemic, they will remain nervous of crushed elevators, crowded subways, etc. So all of that pushes us towards a permanent hybrid future.
On a personal note, I've seen you speak several times during the pandemic, and I've noticed your background dramatically improving as the time's gone on. At first, you had no art, then you had some of your kids' art. Now you have a little bit more professional art. So
that's investment.
Exactly. Everybody's sort of investing in that. Okay, cool. So yeah, I think I would agree with you for all the reasons you said that that it's here to stay. So. And now I want to talk about the effects of hybrid work on things that are a little bit more hard to measure. Do you have a prediction on what the effects of hybrid work are going to be on productivity? Do you have a prediction there? And if you do or don't, also just a way to measure that. Productivity is a very slippery thing to measure. Do you have any thoughts on how to do that?
Great. So I have some numbers, and then I can go to a prediction. So I'd break it up into short and long run productivity. So short run productivity is kind of doing what you've always been doing well. And then long run is creativity and innovation. And on the latter, your paper is honestly, the one in Nature Human Behavior is probably the best piece on it, showing that it looks like working from home is somewhat problematic for communication amongst different groups. So I'm going to focus initially on the former. So on current productivity, the evidence is pretty strong, I'd say, that working from home improves it. So there's a number of papers out there. They don't all come to the same number, but there's 2 our site, that my own, which kind of are very consistent with most of the literature. One is we did a big randomized control trial in China 10 years ago. And there you found that people were 13% more productive working from home, and 4% was they're more productive per minute because it's quieter, and 9% is they work more minutes. It's like, it's easier to go to the toilet. You have a shorter lunch break, you don't get delayed, etc. In surveys I've done during the pandemic, where we've asked people a much more nebulous question about their own productivity, but we're pooling across every industry and person and type, we get very similar numbers. Actually, you get very, very similar numbers that predict that per day you're about 10% more productive working from home. Harrington and Emmanuel have a similar paper as well. They show that productivity is probably up about 10%. I'm not, I wouldn't say every paper finds the same thing, but I think the consensus pretty much is, for current activity, we are more productive. Post-pandemic, there's a question as how much that will impact aggregate national productivity. My guess is kind of 3 to 5%. And the reason for that is, only half of people can work from home. So currently at most ever half work, as half of people are like frontline retail, manufacturing, services, public sector, who've kind of lost on this. They haven't got this nice benefit. And then those that can would probably post-pandemic, on average, the survey evidence suggests, will be working from home roughly half the time. So take half of people, allow them to work from home half of the time, you get 1/4 of the full effect. The full effect is mainly 13%, so you get something like 3-4%, which is a lot. Just to put it in context, the US was gaining productivity at 1% per year pre-pandemic. The OECD average was a bit below that. So 3 to 4% is a big shift, but it's not going to revolutionize the world.
So, long story short, is what you're sort of getting at here, in a sort of roundabout way, is that your very influential paper on the Chinese work, the study you did in China, you see those results generalizing to other settings. That's kind of one punchline of what you're getting at.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't even expect it. Look, I trusted my result. Just to be clear, what we did in China was very narrow in scope. It was it was in trip.com. So the company wasn't unusual. It was a tech company, basically.
Yep.
The offices look a lot like Silicon Valley offices and Microsoft offices and investment banks, but they were in China. And B, particularly the task was kind of unusual. So they're in call centers, taking calls, making bookings. Right. Now, that lent itself very nicely to measuring performance extremely accurately.
Exactly.
And also to randomizing, because you're not working in teams. But, that final point is the thing that was kind of the critical weakness. You aren't working in teams. These are people working individually. So I would have thought, look, when the entire economy flipped to working from home, as it did in March 2020, there'd be a real loss of communication. And your work shows that, yes, just so everyone knows, your paper shows that when you shift to working from home, there's more asynchronous communication.
That's right.
And less synchronous. So basically people are emailing and slacking and messaging more and talking less. But B, more importantly, they're doing it more within their teams and less across teams. That's the thing I would have feared, that we don't meet new people in the canteen and meetings. We don't, go for a drink after work and chat to the person in the other division and come up with a new idea. As of yet, aggregate data shows this hasn't been that much of a problem, but I don't think we can remain forever fully at home, which is why I think it's important we do go back to hybrid, let's say 2-3 or 3-2.
And you see that as a kind of nice middle ground to get those spontaneous and serendipitous interactions at the canteen, like you said, and versus, fully remote where you don't get those.
Yeah, I mean, a well-designed hybrid plan I may personally go for 3-2. So let's say you come in the office 3 days a week. Yep. Those 3 days a week, everyone within the same team or whatever group you're working with agrees on. So that means that, your whole team is in on those 3 days, and you make them, exhaustingly social days, like you have leaving events and lunches and, drinks, and every meeting is on those 3 days. So by the end of those, each one of those days, you're like, I don't want to see anyone else anymore. But then all of the quiet time that normally you did in the office, you now reshuffle. So doing work with data, reading, preparing reports. So you are probably spending almost as much time face to face with your colleagues as you were before, but you've now crushed it into 3 days, of which the joy is the 2 days you don't have to commute, which is a big saving of time. And B, quiet time gets done in a quiet place, aka our own homes.
Yeah, great. So that segues quite nicely to the next thing I want to talk about. I want to touch on some of the societal implications of hybrid work. And I know you have this working paper out now that shows that some of the more dense business districts are sort of emptying out a little bit, and people are moving more to the suburbs. You call it the donut effect, if I remember right. On the one hand, I read your paper. I found it very convincing, very compelling. On the other hand, cities have been densifying for probably about 100 years. It's been a huge trend for humanity. So do you think hybrid work is going to be such a big change to sort of mitigate that densification effect that's been happening for like I said, for almost a century now?
So I don't think it would totally unwind it. So if I give you the history of cities and what's happening now, at least since the 1960s, cities the center of cities have been getting more expensive and the suburbs. Sorry, at least since the 1980s, I should be clear, the center of cities getting more expensive and the suburbs, slightly less so. So if you go to New York Center in 1980, central Manhattan was kind of scary. I remember going as a kid with my parents on holiday, and the McDonald's on Times Square had armed guards with open show guns. I was like, if you go now, there's no security guards at the front entrance to McDonald's, and they certainly wouldn't be carrying guns that they're wearing on their belts. So the last 40 years has seen a big increase in the importance of city centers. What the pandemic has done, and you see this very clearly in the data, is lead to a lot of people, a lot of particularly techies, folks in finance, managers, professionals, think, if I'm going to be post-pandemic hybrid, I don't need to live as near in the center because I'm only going to have to commute in 2 or 3 days a week. But I do want a bit of space at home for a home office. So why don't I move out a bit? And we have incredibly detailed data from the United States Postal Service. It lists everyone in the US's address in a database, and you can look at it month by month and look at people's movement. And what we see very clearly is for the leading large US cities, about 15% of individuals have emptied out of the city centers. And B, the way that's happened is people in the city centers have typically moved out to the inner suburbs. Those in the inner suburbs have moved out to the middle, those to the middle out to the edge, and some of these folks out to the smaller cities. So there's kind of a waterfall, and everyone's doing the same process. If you loved being in the center of the city, you still live quite far in, just a little bit less far in because you move out to the inner suburbs, So economically, it makes total sense. Everyone's just placing a bit more weight on space and a bit less weight on reducing commute. And as a society, therefore, we've all moved out. But it's still the case that city centers are expensive. It's just rather than being 2019 prices, they may be relatively, say, 2010. They're still very expensive places. You just pushed it back a bit. And I actually think that's very good because the topic you heard in 2019 was the affordability crisis, and it's pushed that back a little bit. And if you think of who really does need to be in the city center, it's actually folks that can't work from home. So people like police, essential services, restaurant employees, service sector workers. So it actually for society is better if, folks in management, tech, finance move out to the suburbs because they can work there, and people that are essential services can now afford to move back in because the prices have dropped a bit.
Do you think the reduction in cost of living from those highly paid management class workers going out you think the reduction is going to be enough for those frontline workers to be able to move back in?
No, I'm always, as an economist, you're always a marginalist. So I just give you the figures. What we've seen is rents, the differential has dropped by about 25%. That's a very big drop.
Sure.
But the price differential has dropped. City centers are relatively now about almost 15% less expensive than the suburbs than pre-pandemic. So that's probably the good, because, the purchase price of housing is a pretty forward-looking measure. So you can think of it as probably, and some of that might reverse, but I guess they'll probably be 10% cheaper. So that maybe unwinds us 5 years. So certainly if there are 3x as expensive, which they might have been pre-pandemic, you're only looking at rather than 300% more, it's only whatever, 280, 290, it's something, but it's not, definitely not the full way. You may hope that, look, as working from home continues to build, as technology in particular gets better, because one of the long run things is technology is clearly improving and working from home, that you may have more of a migration of professionals and managers to the suburbs, and that allows essential service workers more affordably to live in the city centre.
Great. That's a great segue to my next question. Then one of the things we found here at Microsoft is that the shift to working from home exacerbated already present systemic inequalities in the U.S. today. I'm talking about along the dimensions of gender, income, race, disability status, mental health. Working from home kind of really made some of these inequalities even bigger. Do you see hybrid work mitigating these inequalities, exacerbating these inequalities, new inequalities coming up? How do you think about diversity, inclusion with respect to hybrid work?
So it's a really interesting question. I'll take 3 angles on this, which kind of push in different directions. So one angle is just, it's worth mentioning that only half of Americans can actually work from home.
That's
half of people in Northern Europe, I've looked at UK data, much of the OECD, and they tend to be professionals, managers, college graduates, but university graduates. So on income inequality, that's in a way not good, because hybrid work from home is a pretty valuable perk. Survey estimates suggest it's worth 6 to 8%. People really like it. So you're giving something that's a welfare benefit to the richer half. It's also the case, if you look at the jobs that can't, they tend to be more likely to be a minority. They're slightly more likely to be female because they're more face-to-face. So jobs that cannot be done from home tend to be very high on human interaction. So if you just look in the current population survey, you see it skews slightly female. It certainly skews minority. So that's a negative side. The second issue that's a positive issue is there's a number of people that are now able to enter the labor market because of the ability to work from home or hybrid. So over the years, it's been very clear that, say, you're looking after young kids, or you're disabled. I've heard from quite a few disabled people, or maybe you're low income, so you struggle with commute. There are certain groups, particularly women with young kids, you hear it's very helpful for them to be able to enter work or re-enter the labor market after, say, maternity leave, if hybrid work and working from home is allowed. So I think that's a very positive thing to increase labor supply. And older people, actually, I should point out, there's a lot of people in their maybe 60s, 70s that would be happy to work, but maybe just don't want to commute into work with all the stress, 5 days a week. So that's really good. The third dimension is more a management thing about it can cause an issue if it's not managed properly. And this I talk a lot to firms about, which is, I'll take the 3-2 plan. So the 3-2 plan is probably, the vanilla plan of hybrid, 3 days in the office, 2 at home. my concern with it, if unmanaged, is firms really focus on the 3. They tend to not pay much attention to the 2. So they spend a lot of time saying, you've got to be in on these 3 days. I don't know, Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, say, but they don't really focus much on the other 2. The Wednesday, Friday, you can work from home and you can come in. The issue is, plenty of research evidence suggests if you come in on those extra 2 days, you get an advantage in promotion. And it's called, presenteeism, or there's various words for it, but proximity bias. But it's very clear in survey evidence, you get significant, as in, 20, 30% higher rate of promotion. Now, when you cross that with the fact that those people that are likely to want to work from home, those that express high preference to, are particularly college-educated women with young kids, minorities, disabled people, low-income people that live far from the office, you can see a risk that if you don't control this process, you can find, young single men come into the office that live nearby every day. Other groups don't, they get ahead and you get a diversity issue. So I've been raising with firms that it's important not just to, try and manage the number of days in the office, but try and manage the number of days at home so that people that want to work from home don't feel stressed and unable to do it because they're getting left behind. So a classic thing might be actually say, look, we're going to have 2 days each week in the office. When, Wednesday, I don't know, let's say Tuesday, Thursday, we're going to have 2 days definitely at home, Wednesday, Friday, and then Monday's your choice. And then everyone basically is either doing 3-2 or 2-3. And that way, there's no way that someone can feel stressed and left behind and literally be left behind because they actually exercise their choice to work from home in those 2 days.
Cool. Nick, that was, I completely agree. We need to do this carefully, holistically, thinking about everyone's needs, thinking about diversity angle, paying attention to both the 3 and the 2. That's a cautionary tale that I'm gonna take away from this. I'm gonna leave it there for now. I really appreciate your time. It's been great hearing from you, and I look forward to hearing more about your work and your research in this space going forward. So thanks again.
Thanks very much, Sid. Thanks for the interview.
Cheers.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming back to our fireside chat. We are going to continue our discussion on making the future of work both effective and equitable with Professor Kathleen Carley. Kathleen is a Carnegie Mellon University professor in the School of Computer Science. She is director of the Center for Computational Analysis of Social and Organizational Systems, as well as director for the Center for Informed Democracy and Social Cybersecurity. Her research focuses on studying complex social technical systems within an organizational and social theory framework using methods from network science, agent-based modeling, and natural language processing. She's received numerous awards for this research, including a Lifetime Achievement Award in Mathematical Sociology, and her work has influenced policy across several disciplines, including counterterrorism and disaster preparedness. Thanks for joining us today, Kathleen.
Well, thank you. It's my delight to be here.
As we, the discussion that we've been having throughout this track on the new future of work, we've been discussing issues as how work has become increasingly hybrid, and many companies now have a large portion of their workforce collaborating in a distributed manner. So what are your thoughts on how companies should manage within this new type of organizational structure, particularly trying to ensure that their teams succeed in this environment?
Well, I think that the key for many companies is to allow for many different types of collaborations and many different types of work styles and many different types of ways of learning, and to not try to force everybody into the same mold, because that diversity lets you take advantage of the unique features of the different of the new collaborative environment.
And could you talk about what past research in organizational science do you think really applies to these organizations of today, where we have moved towards this kind of remote and hybrid settings at a really unprecedented scale compared to what's been studied in the past?
Well, one of the, some of the big findings from earlier research is that as an organization, if you want to make changes, you have to change both the social network, like who is talking to whom, as well as the culture, like what are they all talking about? What are they thinking about? And this is a unique opportunity now for doing that for many organizations and using the impetus of going more distributed to actually affect new cultural norms around collaboration, making it much more professional. The other thing that a lot of the prior research has shown is that a lot of the linkages or ties that you're used to carry information, like the weak ties, are actually spreading mostly gossip and personal information and not real work related information. So this is an opportunity to actually make the information that flows much more accurate, as long as companies don't go behind closed doors and make decisions in silence without participation.
That's a really interesting observation. While there's been limited data measuring the effects of our sudden move to remote work in a widespread manner, some of the recent research has shown that communication across weak ties has been reduced as we move to remote work settings. So given what you were just saying, do you think that this is a problem for organizations, or do you see it as more of an opportunity to move towards more productive settings?
I personally see it as an advantage to be more productive. When I hear people arguing about the lack of their weak ties and all that, and oh well, we just would happen to get things done in quarters, they're usually people who did most of their work and most of their things through, like schmoozing, right? And that's one style of work, but not everybody works well that way. And in fact, a lot of people who are more shy or who have large family, I mean, there's a lot of different reasons why you're not a schmoozer. And so for them, this environment is actually better.
Great. Well, that does bring me to my next question, because in these sort of hybrid work environments, there's likely to be more variability about the way workers participate in their teams and groups. And how do you think we should move forward to ensure that there's equity across both the participation and evaluation of people in these different types of roles that they're now playing?
Well, I think a big part of it is creating a culture within the organization of respect for different kinds of contributions and an understanding that it's okay for everybody not to be the same and to contribute in different ways. Simple things like, maybe having a corporate spreadsheet that shows the different kinds of ways you can contribute and letting people sign up for different parts based on what they're good at. Things like when you pick people to be on particular teams, don't just always pick who was on it last, or pick people and put people on it because of their gender or their race or because they happen to lead a team like that. But kind of spread out the wealth of being on the team, so to speak, would be another important thing. And to, utilize AI in ways that helps increase, that helps celebrate that diversity and lets people, make adjustments in their schedules and other things by, utilizing AI for more of the kind of boring tasks.
So that's a great point. Do you think that we need new research in that direction to develop AI systems that will facilitate these kind of engagements that you're talking about?
I think what we need is more research on human machine teaming and how to get people to work with AI and use AI and when to take directions from it, when to give it directions, and how to use it as a team member as opposed to research on AI and building the next machine learning tool.
That's a good point. So do you see that the AI systems need to be thought of as a member of the team in some way?
I think some of them will eventually become that, yeah. Mm-hmm. So think of it as an intelligent data assistant, right? Who actually contributes things, yeah.
And do you think that the current research in this direction of human AI teaming is directly applicable to these hybrid work settings, or do you think there needs to be a sort of new view to take into account the what's being optimized in organizations?
In some sense, I feel that the research in human machine teaming it's fairly nascent. It's almost kind of, there really hasn't been enough of it to really say if it's going to be how it's contributing. But, I think you'll see a big advances over the next, 5-10 years in that area.
Great. Well, let me take a little bit of a turn here and say, bring up also as a point of discussion that it's clear from as we've moved to remote work that one of the biggest effects is the reduction in the number of in-person and sort of spontaneous interactions that people will have. And we've sort of talked about how that might impact the flow of information and collaboration, but we haven't talked about how that's used to develop a sense of strengthen the relationships and sort of engagement and buy-in to corporate culture. And so given this new type of environment, how do you think we can develop a sense of belonging and sort of engagement of workers with organization when we have this lack of in-person?
Yeah, well, two things. One is that a lot of our research suggests that teams really function best and understand and trust each other more if they meet at the beginning, okay, face-to-face, and then they can go their separate ways. So it's not that no interaction face-to-face is needed, but that beginning is there. The second thing is to kind of build more corporate culture. A lot of it that's done well electronically in a distributed fashion is done because they create online groups, such as like an online book club or a wine tasting event or or some kind of gaming environment. So it's not that you don't have activities, but that you do it, you create these kind of online kind of things that are possible as well. And I think those things help build a culture, but a lot of building a good corporate culture is about making people feel that they can trust the organization, right? And one of the things that is very easy to do that breaks that trust in a distributed environment is to have meetings about changes in the organization or about new initiatives that are held effectively behind closed doors, where they're by invitation only and it's kept to a small group and it's not told to everyone else, as opposed to letting it be by volunteering, right? And letting people volunteer to be part of that conversation. And I think that's the thing that we need to do, is be more open about new initiatives and not treat them all as cloak and dagger behind the scenes.
And I guess that has made me think about, since I just joined Microsoft recently and all virtually, I have firsthand experience of what it's like to be new to an organization in a completely virtual way. And your point about that at the beginning you need to have these face-to-face interactions. I think a lot of the shift over the last couple of years during the pandemic we've been able to maintain a certain amount of workplace culture based on what has been built up in the past. But as we're moving forward, more and more people are now new to the organization and have never been there in person and never seen people in person. Yeah. So what are your thoughts on how to best develop relationships and this sort of trust and empathy that you were talking about if we can't have those kind of in-person interactions?
So if you can't have it even right at the beginning?
Right.
Well, I think part of it is educating your members and right from the beginning to be very about what kind of online corporate, what kind of distributed culture you want to have, to be open about their schedules, to teach them how to be very open about how long it will take them to do things, to encourage them to let others know what the constraints on their lives are, because by letting people into that part of it, you're effectively creating trust, because you're not creating unreasonable expectations. And I think those are things that will be very helpful.
Great. One thing I wanted to make sure to ask you, because you've done a lot of research recently on the spread of misinformation online, particularly with respect to hot button kind of political topics. Do you see any implications of your research studying those topics for organizations and how information would flow through organizations, particularly if we have this limited communication in person?
Absolutely. So we call this area sometimes social cybersecurity, because it's really about hacking people's minds and the way they think about the world rather than machines. And I think corporations are getting smarter about having cybersecurity teams and being aware of their cyber environment, but they're not very good at maintaining good social cybersecurity practices. And I think one of the things organizations need to do is start developing a social cybersecurity teams, training their people in good social cybersecurity hygiene, helping them understand when their behavior online that there's online work and there's online, talking to, your family, and that while there's some overlap, they're not identical. And so you have to partition, be very much more careful about how you partition data and things like that, so you don't inadvertently engage in insider theft and things like that.
Great, thanks for your thoughts on that. Just to wrap up, since we're running out of time, we've discussed some of the challenges of moving to remote and hybrid work for organizations, but do you see any potential opportunities to improve productivity or innovation as we move towards this new future of work?
Oh, absolutely. I think this movement is fantastic. Because actually I think you'll end up with a happier workplace for a force who's more contented and therefore doing better work, because for one thing, they're not having to spend as much time commuting, which leads to more productive time. For another thing, they can be more honest and open about, I really need to take a personal day here because my, cat got pneumonia or whatever. And again, I think that will make the entire environment better. The other thing I see is that when you have to collaborate in a distributed fashion, it's not that joking and fun times go away, but that people interact with each other much more professionally. And therefore, they interact with people in ways that are less damaging in terms of things like gender inequities, racial inequities, and things like that. There's, because you're seeing everyone else's faces and you see the responses much better. You understand when something you're saying is inappropriate, I think, much better. So I think it'll create a much more fair, equitable, and actually professional environment that is also more productive.
Great. Well, thank you for taking the time to share your thoughts with us, Kathleen. I wish we could have done this in person, but
Absolutely.
We didn't have to fly across the country to do this, so that is one of the advantages. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome to the last fireside chat of the session and the last discussion of the new future of work track at the Microsoft Research Summit. And last, but certainly not least, is Sinan Aral. And Sinan is the David Austin Professor of Management, Marketing, IT, and Data Science at MIT. He's also the director of the MIT Initiative on the Digital Economy and the head of MIT's Social Analytics Lab. In addition to being one of the world's leading experts in social media, he's an active entrepreneur and venture capitalist, and he has more than 2 decades of research and business experience. You may have read his recent book, The Hype Machine, and if you haven't, you definitely should. It talks about the potential power of social platforms in shaping organizations and societies, as well as some of the peril. So, Sinan, as we move to hybrid work, one of the questions that's on everybody's mind is, obviously, how do we increase productivity and well-being in these emerging work settings, even though we don't have any research or short-term data to draw from? We're trying to figure out a new thing. Do you have any advice for people or organizations about how they should be making decisions?
Yeah, I think at this point, we are all grappling with something new. It is something we discover every day, as not only did we experience a a shift to remote work, followed by a hybrid, followed by a dynamic shifting between the two as things change day to day. I think the overall message for organizations is that they can't manage what they don't measure. And so staying in touch with employees, whether it's through surveys, whether it's through meetings about how they are experiencing their new work environment, whether it's through an understanding of privacy forward monitoring of the types of communications that are occurring and how that's related to people's well-being. They're seeking and sharing information and their productivity, performance, and overall enterprise performance. I think measurement is key. And so keeping an ear to the ground is a really important thing in a moment of dynamic change like we're experiencing now.
Do you have any experiments that you're particularly excited to run or think would be particularly interesting to study?
Well, I mean, I think that one thing that I have anecdotally, and I think that some of the most forward-looking research that's been done on this topic, much of it by Microsoft, in fact, recently released, is that we are losing serendipitous interactions, which should be no surprise. The water cooler is a metaphor, but it's also a real thing that we gather around, and we don't have that. And so people are having to make explicit attempts to create those serendipitous connections. For instance, tonight I'm going to go to dinner with a colleague, and I had to work to make that happen. Whereas that would have been something as I was passing, his door on the way out, or during the afternoon, I would have said, hey, let's get dinner one night this week. It would have been something that would have been organic. So now what was organic and serendipitous, we're having to explicitly plan in advance for, and we need to do that. Otherwise, the unplanned, quote unquote, interactions that we typically have will be lost. So experiments, I think that each company needs to start experimenting with new ways of not losing or bringing back some of the things that we lose face-to-face, that asynchronous, not that asynchronous, but that serendipitous communication, the communication that is, as we will probably discuss, bridging communications across groups and across different clusters in the organization that typically don't talk.
Yeah, no, and actually that's a great point that you're bringing up about sort of the collaboration networks have fundamentally changed. So it's not just how we're communicating, that it's less spontaneous or less serendipitous, but the actual structure of the networks is changing. Weak ties are getting weaker, Do you have any thoughts around what these structures are going to mean, the changes that we're seeing are going to mean for work at a broad scale?
Yeah, so the early work, the rigorous early work is indicating that this shift to remote work is lessening weak ties, lessening bridging ties, lessening cross team ties, and increasing clustering, which means thick communications within groups but not across groups. Now, long-standing research for decades and decades has shown that innovation, creativity, and productivity depend on these weak bridging ties and this diversity of network structure. And the reason for that is because we get novel information across bridges and weak ties and across groups. The reason for that is that groups and teams need to think not just out of the box, but out of the network. Typically, information that comes from an adjacent discipline or an adjacent team will look at a problem that may be intractable given the local knowledge, but that when seen from a different angle or from a different perspective or just out of the normal process of thinking that the team has been doing, can lead to innovation and creativity that solves problems that are intractable without that outside novel information. So if we see that this is happening, we have to find ways to recreate those weak bridging ties in order to maintain innovation and creativity. We do know that clustered social networks or cohesive social networks are good for certain things. So complex tasks that require a team in a coordinated, tight-knit fashion, taking a hill over there in an intellectual sense, clustering is good for those, but some of the innovation and creativity is lost. So we're going to have to make explicit efforts to create and maintain weak bridging ties in this new hybrid and remote work environment.
So is the only solution to go back to in-person, or are there ways that you think we can be actually doing this while remote or hybrid?
I think that there are ways that we can do it while remote or hybrid. I think that what we're seeing in the early data is that people's tendency is to focus on certain channels of communication and to forego others when we go to remote and hybrid work. It's not that weak bridging ties cannot be communicated over remote or hybrid work. It's just that when faced with a decision about which ties to actualize and which ties to not actualize as often in the context of remote and hybrid work, the weak bridging ties are the first to fall by the wayside. So we have to make explicit attempts to retain, recreate, and strengthen those weak bridging ties, to set and ensure recurring meetings of those people are maintained for the explicit purpose of keeping those bridges up, rather than making decisions just based on who do I need to talk to get this work done today. It's typically weak ties are by their very definition less frequent.
Right.
They are less intense modes of communication. And those are the first to go when faced with a triage operation of which ties do I jettison in order to just continue to get my work done. But what we miss is that those weak bridging ties deliver information we may not be expecting will be important to solving novel problems, but end up being over the long run. So we have to make an explicit attempt to maintain them even over remote communications.
Yeah, so as we think about the kinds of information that travel over our networks as well, and like different kinds of information traveling over different kinds of networks, I'm reminded of this surprising finding that you had in a 2018 science paper that you published, where you found that lies spread farther and faster than truth online, because those lies are more likely to be novel or surprising or more interesting to share. And certainly emerging research is showing that remote work is, as you say, impacting collaboration networks. Do you think that organizations are going to need to develop new mechanisms to start surfacing and conveying information differently across organizations?
Well, I mean, certainly this notion of novelty is a really interesting one. So this result on false information spreading faster than the truth, which you're right, we published in 2018, has been replicated. And I think that this idea of this, what we call the novelty hypothesis, is a very real and robust finding. And if you look at the cognitive science literature, you see that human attention is drawn to novelty because that's what's changing in the environment. That's what may change our decision calculus most out of all of the information that we get. If you read the sociology literature, we gain in status when we share novel information because we're seen as being in the know or having access to inside information that other people don't know. And so I think what we have to be wary of is the factual basis of the information that is being transferred over digital media. And, social media wasn't sort of displaced by COVID. It was reinforced and doubled down on during COVID. All of the digital connections saw meteoric rises. All of these companies, whether it's Teams or Zoom or Facebook or Slack, broke records every day during the pandemic. And I think different types of information flowed differently over those media than information communicated face-to-face or perhaps over other communication media. So I think that there will be new tools as well as processes developing within organizations, across organizations, and out in the digital sphere in general on social media and other types of media that try to house, make accessible, and deliver in an automated fashion, in many cases, algorithmically, information that's relevant to people in a way that makes them more productive. We also have to be aware of the pitfalls, as I describe, and you so aptly pointed out in my book, the perils that exist, one of which, as you noted, is this notion that online falsehood trumps the truth. And that's something we have to pay attention to, among other things.
So when you think about the different kinds of information that are traveling over networks and how it looks different, like it's got to be having impact on things that are sort of traditional cornerstones of the workplace, things like culture, things like recruitment and retention, things like people's well-being. You know, do you have thoughts on what we're seeing might impact those sorts of things?
Yes, although not empirically grounded in data. And that's a caveat that I take seriously, because I'm very much one of those people who finds it hard to extrapolate beyond what I know. That having been said, if I were to venture a hypothesis that I haven't tested yet, the idea that in remote work environments, clustered networks are favored to these diverse networks. We know that clustered networks are homophilous, meaning birds of a feather flock together. Clustered networks are full of people like themselves. This is going to potentially have implications for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think that it's important to the culture of an organization that that diversity of communication is maintained, not just for the right information getting to the right people and the propagation and support of creativity and innovation, but also to create a culture of that is accepting and championing of diversity and inclusion, as well as equity. You could imagine, in the worst case scenario, that clustered networks sort of circle the wagons around similar people being clustered together, and that people who should have more of a voice in the organization find themselves more shut out than they have been even in the past, which is a bleak possible outcome that we have to be extremely vigilant about.
Yeah, no, it's a good call out. I wonder if, as we wrap up, and I really appreciate your time, if you could speak to something that you think we can look forward to in this new future of work as we're figuring it all out.
Well, I mean, I think that this type of work, this hybrid remote work, offers many new possibilities to achieve the promise and avoid the peril that these digital technologies enable. The fact that we can now work from anywhere in an effective manner, the fact that the systems have had to become supported because we were all stuck working from anywhere, means that we can travel to new places while working from anywhere, and that can actually lead to create and support the diversity and exploration and experimentation that the diverse networks support. So in other words, for example, just to give you an example, there are nomadic work experiences that are popping up all over the world where employees of a particular firm are digital nomads, and they go to a different work environment and they work with other digital nomads from other organizations. This can be extremely fruitful, even though they continue to work within the walls of the virtual walls of their own organization. They are being impacted by and influenced by and hearing the ideas of a diverse set of people from all over the world. I've seen many people adopt these types of work practices and be enriched by it, bring those ideas from outside of the organization's walls into the organization, and improve the productivity and performance and well-being of themselves and their team members by doing it. So we focused on some of the peril that could come, DEI implications, implications for innovation, creativity, and productivity, but there's also promise in new forms of organizing and work, new systems, processes, and technical systems that support the storing, sharing, and algorithmic curation of information that could be even more productive, as well as opportunities to explore outside the boundaries of the firm and bring those ideas outside that sort of represent the promise. And the real challenge for organizations moving forward will be, how do we concretely achieve the promise while avoiding the potential peril?
Well, thank you very much, Sinan. It's been a pleasure to talk, and I really appreciate your time today.
Thanks very much for the invitation.